Also the leader of our research group on global order and diplomacy. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar this morning. Thank you for coming out. We usually have lower attendance when the weather is like it is today. We have almost a full room and we are very grateful that you're here. So this meeting today is called New Frontiers of Diplomacy, Building Relationships with Uncomfortable Actors in a Changing World. So we will be engaging with an important topic and an important conversation in these times, including the efficacy of diplomacy in the current era. But we're also marking the establishment of a new partnership agreement between our research institute and the European University Institute in Florence. So this is a partnership that we are very excited about and pleased to announce and celebrate. It represents an important milestone in our shared commitment to advancing research, dialogue, and knowledge on European and global defense, diplomacy, and security. So our aim and hope is that this partnership will deepen existing ties between our institutions and our researchers, inspire new research ideas and projects, and contribute to a more integrated European research community. And being in a country that's not a member of the European Union, it's nice to have the ability to talk about integrating with our European friends. And also we seek mobility, and that's a bit of a challenge, right? Because it's Florence and Oslo, but we want researchers to go both ways. And inviting you on a day like this, it might not be very tempting to come to Oslo, but we hope that this will be a mutual partnership in terms of mobility also. So this morning we're meeting at a time when many of the basic assumptions and understandings of the international system is being fundamentally altered. Russia's war in Ukraine continues to have a profound effect in Europe and in the broader world. China's growing economic, technological, and geopolitical influence is affecting Europe's strategic choices. And now these states have for a long time been vocal about their ambitions to challenge the existing international order. Some call it the liberal international order that was built on the ruins of World War II. Now, Europe's closest partner and ally, the US, the very bricklayer of that international system, is also pursuing a foreign policy that explicitly seeks to undermine the norms, institutions, and practices of that liberal, rules-based international order. So we will hear this it's difficult to write new notes for these kinds of introductions because we're all saying the same thing, but then there might be something to it. In seminars, podcasts, on the news, in commentary, the world has now turned towards more strategic competition and rivalry. Great powers will seek to expand their power at the cost of others. International institutions become less effective, and rules no longer dictate the behavior of states on the international stage, at least not all states on the international stage. So our aim is to discuss the implications of this for diplomatic practices. Diplomacy is arguably as old as the existence of borders separating different polities. It is a conservative institution set up to manage the relations between states. Yet once reserved for emperor, princes, and kings, in the modern period, diplomacy has become institutionalized into a complex ecosystem of not only state representatives, but international organizations, NGOs, cities and regions, specialized bureaus, and private companies. And that includes tech bros, which are also diplomatic actors these days. So diplomacy is digital, increasingly so, but it's still intimate. And in a sense, diplomacy in the recent years and under the this previous international order, it has been democratized. So what is the current state of this institution when the world it has been molded in slowly recedes and it is replaced by a new system? There are many important questions to address that we will talk about today. What constitutes effective and reliable diplomacy in today's world? How do states build relationships with actors they may profoundly disagree with, or who challenge the norms and institutions that other states seek to uphold? And how, if at all, can diplomacy serve as a tool for some form of stability, dialogue, and political agency in a more contested and unpredictable world? So we look very much forward to having this discussion in this room today with our guests and our partners from the European University Institute. We thank you for being here despite the weather. And we'll have a panel conversation shortly, but first, some introductions from our new partner, Erik Jones, who is the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University. Erik.
So it's such a great pleasure for me to be here. This is actually my third time in Norway in less than 12 months, which is really exciting. I've gotten to see all different kinds of rain. And for somebody who lives in Florence and you're often sweltering in the heat, it's such a relief to come back to a place where it's cold and windy. And I think that you'll find that getting people to come here is going to be easier than you imagine. I think it's also going to be easier than you imagine because of the nature of the partnership that we have with Norway, we, the European University Institute, with Norway, and now with NUPI. I'll start with the Norwegian partnership. Norwegians don't like to admit it, but you're much more integrated in Europe than you really expect. We have one of the closest partnerships with a non-European Union member state with the Norwegian government. The Norwegian government sponsors our Stein Rokon chair in democratic politics, which plays an important role in educating Europeans from across the continent in how democracy works. The Norwegian government also sponsors many Norwegian students to come as doctoral researchers to the European University Institute. And if you know of anyone who's interested to apply for the doctoral program, I would encourage you to encourage them to participate in the competition. We benefit enormously from their insights. Having said that, the European University Institute had the great privilege for many years to think that its primary focus for attention should be what's going on inside the European Union. We've elaborated an enormous number of programs that focus on different policy areas, migration, energy, and media pluralism, and the like. The difficulty is that what's going on inside the European Union is only a small microcosm of the issues that we have to confront today. And the most important issue that we have to confront today is that our assumption that there was an international system that was structured by rules was really predicated on the reality that the rules that were prevailing were rules that were written to our benefit intentionally, with the idea of stabilizing Europe and the transatlantic partnership. Many other parts of the world looked at the same rules and did not like them. And we presumed that these rules were ubiquitous and universalist, but they were never intended to function that way. And now we find ourselves in the presence of an awkward partner in the United States, and that awkward partner has decided that it's not only going to break the rules, but it's going to use rule-abiding behavior as a vulnerability to be exploited. When you think about it, this is what Donald Trump is doing. He's looking at European partners and saying, I'm not going to abide by the rules, but you are, and since you are, I'm going to use the rules to extract money and influence and power from you. I'm going to redefine the rules in a way that the things that you are trying to do to stabilize your economic and political situation is suddenly no longer acceptable. I'm going to deprive you of that. If you were to look at the national security strategy that was published last December, you'll see that it is in many ways intentional. The Trump administration wants to divide Europeans by pretending that the rules we use to come together violate the rules that define the international system or the common civilizational background, to use the language of the report, that the United States and Europe have together. Now, this kind of behavior is not something the European Union was designed to resist. And it's not something that the European Union can resist effectively in isolation. Our partnership with NUPI is vital because Norway is part of Europe. The European Union is not Europe. Europe is larger. Norway is not only part of Europe, it is a vital part of Europe for securing our northern frontier, for providing irreplaceable energy resources, for offering insight on how dangerous the world can be to a European population that has lived in splendid isolation from power politics for generations. Coming to NUPI is so refreshing because it's not only a question of understanding the nature of power politics, but it's also a question of understanding the psychology of international relations at a deeper level. I sat on a prize committee last year that focuses on the role of ideas in politics. And nothing could have surprised me more than to see the winner of the competition emerge as a theoretical work from a think tank that studies international relations, a work on the grammar of status competition. NUPI has so many things to offer us that we have not thought about and that we need carefully to consider. So we celebrate this partnership as an opportunity to learn, not from people who've studied the European Union exclusively as a hermetically closed system, but from people who've studied the world and different patterns of engagement and who are ready to help us think outside the box in order to reinterpret a framework where norms are being replaced by power at a speed and pace that our minds are struggling to adapt to. We need your help. We need your insight, and we need you to come down from time to time to Florence. Right? I know that's a huge ask, but if we could convince you to do that, it would be worth everyone's while. Having said that, this whole idea of awkward partnership is at the center of the conversation that we're going to have today. It's at the center of the conversation that we're going to have today because awkward partnership is all about the violation of rules and norms. That's what makes it awkward. And we're moving into an international system where the norm and rule is we should expect our partners to be awkward. How are we going to redefine diplomacy when we don't like the people we're talking with, when we don't trust them? Trust them to be predictable, when they're using their unpredictability as a source of power and leverage against us. That's not an easy problem to solve. One of my former colleagues, Alex Stubb, now the president of Finland, has proven himself adept at encountering awkward partners and extracting as much value as he can from those interactions. Whether that's a generalizable model, I'm not sure I know. I'm looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say and to benefiting from their insight. So, without wasting any more of your time listening to myself speak, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to work with us. Thank you for hosting us to celebrate that agreement. And thank you for the insights that you bring into a conversation that for too long inside the European Union we have not invited or attended to as closely as we should. So thank you, and please, if I could invite the panel to come up and enlighten us.
Thank you, Erik. Great remarks. Norway is a vital part of Europe. We have so much to contribute. I don't know if our country needs more exceptionalism in our view of our role in the world, but it's duly noted, and thank you so much for that. We have a panel, as you can see. It's a great panel. It's to my left here, Christian Syse, who has had a long and prominent career in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's currently the MFA Special Envoy to Ukraine, but it was just announced he's moving, and he's been appointed as ambassador to the OECD and UNESCO in Paris. Johan Wibe has also had a long career in the MFA, but is now the director of NOREF, the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution. We have Simone Tholens, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at John Cabot University, also affiliated with the European University Institute. And finally, Jon Karlsrud from NUPI, a research professor here and one of two coordinators of our newly established Center for Ukraine Studies. And I'll start with you, Jon. We started talking about the state of the world, and now we want to put that in conversation with, diplomacy. Does it work? How can it work? How must it change? So what is your sort of broader assessment of how diplomacy is faring in this world that we're entering?
Thank you so much. Let's start off maybe where Erik stopped in a way. So we are in a world with increasing geopolitical rivalry. Uncomfortable actors now also include the US, which is a bit surprising if you look a few years back. And diplomacy has, of course, there's literally more stuff to do. But I would also like to draw up maybe a bit larger picture. Because as we see, international institutions like the UN is becoming gridlocked and more difficult to come to agreement in these institutions. So instead, and this has been going on for quite a while, there has been more informality in global governance. More informal partnerships like the G20 is gaining ground and has been doing steadily so for the last 20 years, we can say, particularly after the financial crisis. We see ad hoc coalitions in the security domain, but also in quite other domains that are being very important actors. But these are different types of actors, and they are more short-term than the institutions that we have built up after the Second World War. So this has consequences. And we also see much more private actors. So Gates has been fundamental in the area of global health. Global firms, hyperscalers like Google, Microsoft, they are basically some of the most influential actors when it comes to global digitalization and how policy should evolve in that area. So what are the consequences then for diplomacy? Well, it makes it much more challenging. I think to realize how much more challenging it is, because you have to have, and we have, together with Marina Rybinovic and Marianne Ridvold, who's sitting here, we developed a concept of diplomatic resilience, because this demands a lot more from diplomacy. Diplomacy, and we define it as the capacity of a state and its broader networked diplomatic ecosystem to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and transform in response to an evolving international environment. So, I mean, bumps in the road, we can absorb them. That's still part of the kind of the traditional work of diplomacy. And we can also probably still adapt to change, but this also, all these changes in the environment that diplomacy is operating in, demands something more. It demands also transformation and using, engaging with these actors, private actors, new actors, sub-state actors, Gates, Microsoft, OpenAI. I mean, this is demands also new themes. So you need to have skills and knowledge in new topics. You have to also be more places. Decisions are not only made at the UN in between states. There is a ongoing bilateralization of relationships, and Norway is a good example. When we see that NATO and other constellations that we're part of don't provide the same security net that we might have thought for so long, we are also engaging very effectively, maybe, and intensively into bilateral discussions. So Norway just signed an agreement with UK, just with Germany, and there are ongoing work with other states to create kind of a security net that is kind of backing up what we used to have. Yeah, and we need new tools. It's new arenas, also digitally, etc. So I think there's pretty big challenges put on the diplomatic system at the moment of Norway and other states to engage. And I would just like to make an example, because the grain from Ukraine initiative. I think it shows how Ukraine that didn't really realize that it needed the global south in arenas like the UN until the war hit them. But then with the grain crisis, it became very clear that the global south states, they were dependent on grain from Ukraine, and they found a way to strike new alliances and establish new connections through that. Yeah, so this will be my opening kind of contribution.
Thank you, Jon. Simon, I'm really interested in your same assessment on that question, but also, like in your recent research, you've talked about strategic intimacies, which you define as deeply personal and materially entangled relationships that underpin security interventions. Can you unpack that for us in a layman's language?
Yeah, no. I first of all want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited about this NUPI EUI partnership. As to see sort of the anchoring and indeed entanglement of Norway in the European security and defense architecture, also when it comes to knowledge production. And as a Norwegian who has done my doctoral studies and the PhD at European University Institute, and also has spent a period here at NUPI, completing that PhD, I'm just really excited about this partnership. So, on to the topic of today, I really want to discuss a little bit around security cooperation. So I think that in addition to diplomacy, I think security cooperation is undergoing quite some significant changes. And part of that is discursive, part of that is in material terms. So, obviously we have some important shifting tides in international relations, and this means revisiting the repertoires. And I think there's a lot of kind of soul-searching across Europe currently. And the West in general, and so Europe in particular perhaps, it is rethinking what the German Chancellor Merz was referring to as a sort of a practice or a tradition of normative surplus. So as we are sort of in a moment where we are questioning Europe's connection with normativities and promoting norms and rules in its external relations, we really need to, I think, also indeed look at the repertoires to come, especially when it comes to security cooperation. Now, of course, we can, I think, question to the extent which values and norms were consistently promoted in European external relations, and North African state will know a thing or two about democracy promotion versus migration management, for instance. But I think certainly we have a sort of an explicit call right now to rethink what security cooperation could and should achieve. Now, clearly, it is not mainly about promoting certain norms, even if I think good governance may be conducive also to advance more effective defense systems. I think it's also quite clear that multilateralism is certainly not dead, but it is being reconfigured. And I think deeper competition, as has been said before, will indeed continue to define this space of international relations. We also, of course, have a whole new set of actors who have entered the scene, who are capable and willing also to engage in security partnerships. So this is changing the landscape, and this is the domain of operation which we then now have to really think about what influence means in international politics. It's a vague and, I think, if not ill-defined term of central relevance to any political actor, but certainly the world in which we find ourselves in. So the question I'm asking is what will happen with, let's say, Western influence practices as we transition from an sort of outward-oriented missionary to a more inward-oriented monastery, as Ivan Krastev has put it. So indeed, in a recent article that I published with Cooperation and Conflict, and I want to give my compliments to the Nordic International Studies Association under the NUPI editorial leadership, I developed this concept of strategic intimacy to analyze indeed how anchoring practices operate in partnership more generally, and certainly in security partnership. And I argue here that precisely because boots on the ground military interventions are unappealing for a number of both political and technological reasons, and sort of more remote strategies are the preferred options, contemporary cooperation actually hinges on the capacity to forge indeed quite intimate relations, and they are both deeply personal and deeply material. Indeed, it requires, I would say, sort of solution-minded and creative individuals that know how to handle values and legal obligations on the one hand, with getting things done in local context. And this is a difficult, I think, practical dilemma, but also connected with material capacities to connect geographies. Also through what is called indeed, both through defense system and technology, but also through stratcom. So actually strategic messaging towards particular target audiences. And then also perseverance, even when results are not necessarily immediately forthcoming. So this is a practice which obviously is quite, I think, hard to codify and develop performance criteria for, which is a major, I think, democratic problem in part. It is often quite temporarily ambiguous. There's not necessarily a sort of an end state which is clearly defined. And it may be quite hard to justify in front of domestic audiences, both in provider and recipient states. And so herein lies the real challenge, how to build strategic intimacy, as I call it, while maintaining principles and a sort of a moral compass. So I think Europe is really waking up to this new reality very fast. It's taken responsibility for territorial defense. The realization that the global has shrunk, or at least it's defined by more competitive practices. And I would also say that Europe has a particular challenge in this regard. We do have, I think, the remnants of, let's say, post-colonial instincts, which the United Kingdom, France may to some extent be, let's say, willing to get engaged. But what about Europe at large? And I think dealing with uncomfortable actors is obviously part and parcel of diplomacy as an institution. But as an informal practice, which indeed Jon was laying out, by a variety of actors. It is as a hard political field to command and control. And I think that, and I want to end with this note, that a fear of political backlash has been sort of shaping the fact that there's been little visibility, both on security cooperation, but also on broader diplomatic, let's say more informal diplomatic practices. And I think now is actually the moment to think, to democratize this space and really think carefully about the issue of transparency, because it's vital to get European publics on board with what this new world requires. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Johan, as I've noted, you've gone from being a state representative and gone into NOREF.
Yeah.
And I would say that conflict resolution and peace mediation has probably been the sharpest end of Norwegian diplomacy in recent decades. But now in the world we see more conflict emergence and conflict resolution. So how is this landscape looking from your position?
Thank you so much, and first of all, congratulations to the UI and to NUPI for this new agreement, also the Italian embassy, actually, because this is an important part of the bilateral relationship as well, and with Europe, of course. But as a representative of NOREF, I will focus, of course, on informal diplomacy, because NOREF is actively engaged in mediation initiatives between conflict parties. And NOREF is, as you may know, financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it operates in close synchrony with Norwegian foreign and security goals, but with a room to operate in the space of informal diplomacy. And it was interesting to what you talked about, John, about informal diplomacy as a challenge, but I would say it's also a tool, and this is what we try to explore. And I must say, this informal diplomacy, it's not a transaction of the transactional kind exercised by millionaires and golf players. And I would not call it a private diplomacy either, or freelancing diplomacy, which has also been used in the Norwegian press. It's rather an arm of diplomacy that allows for exploring opportunities to bring conflict parties together, to talk and create safe spaces for what may later evolve into more formal channels where Norway as a state takes a more direct stake. And these mediation efforts are value-based and putting a lot of emphasis on international law, ownership of the parties, impartiality and inclusion. But as you all know, there is less consensus about these values today, which makes the task more difficult. And I would say the informal diplomacy has several advantages as a tool, because formal diplomacy cannot always reach or act adequately in situations. And Jon was referring to gridlocked institutions, for instance. And I can mention, for instance, in the Sahel belt, the international cooperation going in there, for instance, with the ECOWAS, has been strongly limited by the series of coups you had there. So if you are able to organize spaces of informal diplomacy where these countries can get together again and talk, it can be an important tool, because these countries need to talk in order to solve the common problems related to the jihadist situation. So this is just one of many examples. Also, I would say some places the formal diplomacy cannot reach. For instance, no diplomat today would ask for diplomatic visa to go to Sana'a in Yemen. Informal diplomacy can reach that way. I would also say that informal meetings are less ritual and less prone also to polarizing discussions. So they enable the creation of safe spaces where you can run through de-escalation measures, prepare a roadmap, and then the parties may later, at a later stage, come out and actually take these steps in a controlled way. I will also say informal diplomacy channels may mitigate some of the political risk for parties and also for the government that is enabling informal diplomacy. Norway has a long tradition engaging in conflict diplomacy through humanitarian organizations, think tanks, or action tanks like NORF. And it's also very interesting to see how a country like Qatar is also involving informal actors in their efforts. Not only to supplement their knowledge, because they have a limited apparatus, but they are very active in very many corners of the world. But they also use informal diplomacy there as a tool. And I believe this tool is becoming more relevant than before. We have already had long discussions or long presentations about the breakdown of the international order. I think this sometimes goes a bit too far. I mean, I see Mark Leonard, for instance, from the ECFR is now talking about unorder instead of disorder. In a way, pointing to the fact that there's no order at all, which is not true, I think. There's still a lot of order, but there is also disorder, and we need to deal with that. And but one thing I picked up from the same author is that we need to look more into what he calls the artisan game. Norway has insisted a lot of being the what he calls the architects, which is that we state publicly strongly our support to international law and the international order, and it's important to, of course, uphold that discourse. But we also look how can we be artisans in this environment and try to, prevent things from breaking even more down. And and I think this is also very relevant, and I think this is part of the discussion we need to have here in Norway also, why this is relevant for our own security and welfare. We can probably get back to that in the debate later as well. And what are the things that can be done? First of all, now in the situation we have with Iran, there's a lot of talk of how can we create off-ramps how can we get out of this situation? There's a lot of thinking needs to be done there, and also activity. The other issue that is interesting, I think, is you were talking in your introduction, the awkward partnerships. And Norway has a strong partnership with the United States, a partnership we definitely want to preserve. But we also do not always look eye to eye on how different peace processes are handled. And I believe supplementing some of the, let's say, I would say the incomplete US peace initiatives can be an interesting exercise for also for informal but also for formal diplomacy. And just to very quickly, I will get to the end here, just that if you look, for instance, at the first drafts for the Ukraine peace process that were presented, they were not very complete, so to speak. One of the lack of completeness was, of course, that Ukraine wasn't supposed to be at the table. And I saw there mobilization in Europe in order to ensure that Ukraine would actually be sat at the table. And I'm sure Christian can develop that theme more. But you see it the same with the Middle East. In the first plan that was presented, it was in many ways incomplete, notably because the Palestinians were not given any role. I think an important role for Europe is to ensure that all parties are represented when these kind of processes are handled. I think I'll stop there, not to make you angry. And thank you.
Very far away from being angry. Thank you so much for that intervention. Now, Christian, you were mentioned. I think not many, if any, knows the history of Norwegian diplomacy and the Norwegian Foreign Service better than you. And now, in recent years, you've been working with Ukraine, which Johan mentioned. How, where I think we see at least one component of this new type of diplomacy. So your assessment of how does that look? Maybe looking out from Ukraine, but also in general as someone from the MFA who knows its history as well, where it's coming from.
Well, thanks very much for those very kind words. I'm not quite sure, but my task here was to cover this diplomacy and multilateral cooperation at large. So I'll try to answer that point. But starting out with, I will seek to make 3 points. And the first one is actually going back to 1905, when the Norwegian Foreign Service was established after the dissolution of the Union with Sweden. We didn't have our own foreign ministry at that time. A vast majority in the parliament, in Stortinget, then explicitly stated that traditional diplomacy, and particularly secret diplomacy, that should be none of Norway's business. So, Johan, you would have been out of business in 1905. Why was that the case? Well, we didn't have that kind of multilateral organizations that we have today, of course. However, it was one didn't believe in the traditional forms of diplomacy. That was Norwegian public policy. We should support our ship owners and industrialists abroad. That was basically the task of the Foreign Service. So we have moved on since that time. But we are not the first one who should say that, well, everyone else should do multilateralism and cooperation. We were not in on that game. Second, I take issue with multilateralism being dead. You talked about it, Johan, also. Not at all. Not at all. In January, at the annual conference of the Norwegian Confederation of Enterprise, NHO's årskonferanse, the Director General of the World Trade Organization was there. It was a brilliant speech. And what she said was basically that 80% of world trade in goods and services are under the auspices and they follow WTO rules. Don't forget it. It's amazing. There are many, many other examples as well. Soon we will have the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. They function enormously well. To a lesser extent, perhaps the ambitions have always been slightly unclear, but also on different continents. ASEAN, the African Union, less than it perhaps could have been. The Shanghai Cooperation. All these organizations work fairly well, as a matter of fact. And they haven't been all that much affected by, this is very typically Norwegian, I think. We are so engaged in what happens in the United States, and for obvious reasons, for correct reasons, but also for, I don't know, people would, in general in Norway, know more about the midterm elections in the United States, and particularly, constituencies in the state of Georgia, than they would about the German federal elections. Well, anyway, the World Trade Organization already mentioned. I will be going soon to the OECD. Works fairly well, as a matter of fact, in spite of the fact that the United States is challenging an organization which it started out building itself. But the primary example must be the European Union. It is an amazing multilateral mechanism that overall functions well. I would dare say that it functions far beyond any expectation, in spite of Hungary and Slovakia. It functions enormously well. And a number of European countries, they would like to become a member of the European Union even. I mean, perhaps even our friends up in Iceland, but in the Western Balkans and, naturally, Ukraine. It functions well. Free trade agreements, another multilateral instrument. Well, free trade agreements, they have had a renaissance over the past couple of years. Not the opposite. Say the European Union's agreement with Mercosur of South America, with India, covering 1.4 billion Indians. It's amazing. Multilateral cooperation works enormously well. And here, back here in Norway, we are then founder members of EFTA, European Free Trade Association, together with our friends in Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. We have also got well-functioning free trade agreements, and we are negotiating more of them. European Economic Area, covering 30 states in Europe, 27 European Union states, and then the 3 EFTA states party to the European Economic Area Agreement. It functions well. It doesn't only function well. It is an amazing mechanism that also serves the European Union well. I won't hear any speak of the multilateralism being dead, say, when it comes to the European Economic Area, or the European Union for that matter. Was everything better in the old days? Well, look at the history of the United Nations Security Council. Major countries, permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, have floated multilateralism on a number of occasions. That goes for the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, the United States, and even others. Say, United Kingdom intervention in Suez, 1956, as one of many, many examples. Does it function less well now than it used to? I don't know. I'm no specialist in the United Nations, but I'm not quite sure. The jury is still out. And one might have to accept that the United Nations, well, it's ready for some sort of an overhaul all the same. So my major point being that one shouldn't underestimate the longevity and the force of multilateralism, in spite of the fact that the United States has changed course, supported directly or indirectly by the Russian Federation, and perhaps also the amazing thing that the second most influential nation in the world, the People's Republic of China, has now become the new defender of multilateralism cooperation. Does it matter? Of course it matters. All right. Then moving on to my third and final point then, Ukraine. I'm amazed how well support to Ukraine has functioned. In the military field, civilian, humanitarian. Well, more should have been forthcoming at an earlier stage. We will all accept that now. Looking back to February, March 2022, and what we could deliver at that time, all too little. Everyone understands that. But look at the situation today. Well, perhaps Ukraine should have had much, much more in every conceivable field. However, what we do, big we, capital W, it's not bad at all. The United States has reduced its support to Ukraine by 99%, which basically is 100%. Has Europe stepped up? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Not fully covering the withdrawal of the United States, but not bad. The European Union countries such as Norway and other countries outside the European Union, Canada, Japan, Republic of Korea. And again, wow, why isn't South Africa supporting? What about India, Brazil? Well, but let's not underestimate that many countries, including the European Union, but also other European states and others, have stepped up. What is this? This is multilateralism. Multilateralism at work. I will be leaving for Kiev in 1.5 weeks' time for what is known as the Ukraine Donor Platform, which is a G7 cooperation, trying then to coordinate all civilian assistance to Ukraine. Probably Prime Minister Svirodenko will chair the meeting together with Finance Minister Marchenko, two excellent people. Well, the United States used to be represented in that organ on a deputy national security advisor level. Now it's a more junior guy coming along from the State Department. But barring that, it functions well. It serves Ukrainian purposes well. It's multilateralism at work. So, summing up, don't underestimate the force of multilateralism and the organizations that we have. And let's try to make the most of it.
Thank you, Christian. I think on the point 2 and on multilateralism, we've reflected a lot on that as well in the research community, because we are in a time where a lot of stuff is happening. We're chasing developments, and there is more alarmism in the so-called expert community than among policymakers, at least broadly here, and also diplomats, who tend to, as I said, try to be bearers of continuity. So it's also in your perspective to say that things are fine. And in some of
I didn't say they were fine.
No.
Don't underestimate it.
Yes, don't underestimate it. Thank you. There is in research on diplomacy sort of attempts at theorizing that diplomats subscribe to this tipping point logic. They have to defend the old world. They have to defend the system that exists until at some point the politicians make it impossible through their decisions, and then you have to reorient your perspective. And we might be going towards that, or multilateralism is at least stable in some areas. But I think it's a really good way to ask a new question to every one of you, because I think Erik mentioned Stubb, the Finnish Prime Minister, and there is a global competition of defining the world among leaders as well, and also how to deal with it. And from all of you guys, I think I hear 3 things. It's our world that's changing the most. So multilateralism works, but the Western world, the transatlantic partnership, is in a crisis it hasn't been. But multilateralism is working, and I also hear that a diplomatic service and a foreign policy for this world needs to be more global and attentive to its utility all across the world. And then the policy responses, returning to Stubb, also is this values-based realism. And that has also been, the EU institutionalized this in 2016 as principled pragmatism. We are principled on our values, which is the foundation of the treaties, but in this world we need to be pragmatic and pursue our interests when we need to do that. And I think a lot of scholars are some unease with this concept. Can you actually combine these 2 things? And I think based on all your introductions, you can reflect on that. Is values-based realism going to work as a sort of a grand strategy for diplomacy in this world? Let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. I guess North is a kind of an example of it, no? How Norway has engaged with also those actors beyond the pale, as it's saying in diplomacy, on a on a continuous basis for many years, and that is kind of the hard currency that Norway carries also in the relationship to the U.S., for example. So I think. When there is a lot of talk about Norwegian peace diplomacy and this is idealism, I think that's a skewed picture in a way. Could I also respond a little bit on how multilateralism is working or not?
Of course you can.
Later, okay. Because I think we have to kind of granulate or differentiate a bit. Multilateralism becomes a bit too big of a word. And international institutions many of them are definitely being challenged, and a lot of cooperation is moving to other arenas. So that's certain, and I think Christian also mentioned it. I mean, G7, informal partnerships. And for some organizations, it's fairly clear that it's not working very well. For example, there's 61 conflicts in the world last year. That's a record, while UN peace operations is at a low for many, many years, since 1990, I think. At the same time, you had a record number of discussions and meetings in the council, but only a few resolutions, the lowest number since 1990 again. So there's definitely challenges in several of the established institutions, and that's what we see that there's a lot of those talks. The cooperation is moving to other arenas, and that demands more of diplomacy.
Yeah, no, you already gave me an introduction here with the value-based realism, and I think definitely this is a policy Norway has subscribed to a long time. It's a difficult balance, as you mentioned, but I think Norway took a clear stand already in 2006 when deciding not to adhere to the European Union's terrorist list, because we felt this would be an instrument that would limit Norway's possibilities to engage. And engagement has proved to be important. Engagement is also important with governments that we do not necessarily feel very close to, also authoritarian regimes. Norway has done that repeatedly. It's very often criticized. This criticism is coming back into the debate now, but I believe this is an important part of it. Also, I think we have to be aware, getting back to these awkward partnerships, that today very much of conflict resolution is done at very high levels. The reason is not only Donald Trump. The reason is simply that the world today is characterized by not only more use of military might in order to solve conflicts, but also because big parts of things we took for granted before, like value chain, transportation routes, ports, infrastructure, is weaponized. And when everything becomes security, the level of policy decisions goes up the chain. So you actually need to deal with also some unsavory parties if you wish to solve a problem. And I must say that in the mediation world in Europe, maybe focus has been very much on, let's say, grassroots initiatives that are very important because you need to talk to the people that are involved. But unless you connect them to this world which is higher up, it's very difficult to move forward. One example again, Yemen. It's impossible to find probably a solution in Yemen without having a dialogue with the Emirates and the Saudis and the US. So I think this illustrates part of this balance between the value-based and the realism or pragmatism.
Just follow up. In Norway we say that vi snakker med alle.
Yeah.
We speak to everyone.
Yes.
Is that more difficult in a world where there's more rivalry and maybe expectations from different actors, that you just simply don't talk to certain actors, or is that something we can still do?
In a way it's more difficult because it's more sensitive, but I think it's more important than before. And I must say also I'm a little bit concerned about the restrictions that are being put on this in the debate. Although it's interesting to see the United States, who has the strongest legislation on this, because they have legislation that says that it's material support to terrorism to serve them a cup of coffee or give them advice. But you see today that American actors are actively engaging, from Vladimir Putin to listed terrorist organizations directly, which didn't happen before. Yeah.
Thank you. Simone, values-based realism.
Yes.
Is it a is strategic intimacy a part of values-based realism?
Potentially. I think that this is, values and realism. This is an absolutely artificial or sort of skewed, binary or dichotomy. This is, I think, partially discursive, and communicatively, it is quite difficult to, I think, come up with other credible alternatives. We are quite set in our ways. We are accustomed to thinking in these as sort of opposites. And I think that indeed, strategic intimacy obviously is a sort of more academic term. This is not going to be floated in any sort of more policy circles. But I do think it captures exactly the fact that there is a realization that setting up this dichotomy has not done as well in terms of communicating what we are actually doing, right? And which is not a new thing in a sense. But I want to say that in my reading, there's sort of two ways of thinking about relationships. One is where, with a discrete set of interests and discrete set of objectives, you seek partners. Those partnerships should be and must be in this kind of image centered on a sense of reciprocity, a sense of mutual respect, and to some extent a trust that an agreement will be respected. The other model is more around, let's say, patronage, right, which is based on loyalty, building clientelism or patronage type of relationships, and where somehow let's say there is a mutual benefit, but it is more based on a more hierarchical structure. Now, these two models are ideal types, but I think they are instructive a little bit for the way we must also think about, making relationships with external parties. So I just want to say a final thing, which I do think that you said alarmism, there's a perception. Right, and perceptions of disorder, unorder, or even fracturing are very, very important, And I think we are indeed in a space where these perceptions cannot fully be controlled. And, it's important, again, to both communicate and insert some transparency, I think, in sort of the way we operate in order to counter in part a perception of a full disorder of the world, because I would certainly agree with my colleague here that there is more continuity than change, if you like, and so this is a definitely important space to shape the debate better.
Thank you. I sense not all that much enthusiasm for the concept of values-based realism. I'm not sure, but Christian, you may also reflect on it. But also, I was wondering, given the world, does the MFA need to reform? Do the foreign services need to change? Are they set up for the world that we're currently in?
Before answering that, I would like to make three brief remarks. One might easily argue that multilateral cooperation has been strengthened over the past couple of years, perhaps as a consequence of United States policies. Look at the cooperation between European member countries of NATO, strengthened enormously. The European Union, too, a sense of urgency, not only because of the Draghi report. But by the way, I think that nothing will happen from the Draghi report. We had the Lisbon process 25 years ago, nothing happened. Well, anyway, that's another discussion. But anyway, the sort of urgency, say in the defense-related fields of the European Union, it's strengthened. Okay. Second, we haven't particularly mentioned development assistance until now, have we? Which is value-based diplomacy for all it's worth. What is quite interesting there is that in the wake of the United States reducing its development budgets, that is happening all over the world, all over the, among the G7s, etc. All the G7 countries reduced their development assistance. The United Kingdom is down to 0.3% of gross national income, which is quite amazing. I used to be ambassador to Sweden, so Sweden considered itself the Jerusalem on the height, the leading nation in the world in development assistance. And now, almost without opposition apart from the sort of left fringes, they're down to 0.7%. And then add to that 25% of Norway's as well as Sweden's development budget goes to Ukraine. So the traditional development assistance has been changed dramatically, not only in the United States, all throughout the G7 countries, United European Union, ourselves included. Well, not ourselves, because we're still up there at 1% of GNI. Only Luxembourg and ourselves. And you will remember that United Nations have had this ambition that donor countries should allocate 0.7% of GNI to development assistance purposes. Do you know how many countries that do that today? 4. So that has changed. So that is in many ways then a weakening of the multilateral system. Well, anyway, up until now it hasn't had that much consequences for the World Bank, the EBRD, the EIB, European Investment Bank, but that will probably follow. So that is a weakening of the multilateral system, probably. Weakening of international law. I'm no lawyer. I'm an economist. I usually divide the world into economists and non-economists. I find that quite useful. My boss, the foreign minister, as well as the boss's boss, the prime minister, have been quite clear on the interventions in Iran that they do not adhere to international law. One might add that Iran supporting terrorist organizations all throughout the world, including in Sweden and Denmark, and possibly Norway. What would we know what happened up at the U.S. Embassy here the other night? Well, anyway, that's pretty much a breach of international laws as well. So there are many facets to that. Is it, if you look back on the past 80 years, has breaches of international law happened before? Dozens upon dozens of times. Then to your question of rearranging the MFA. Fine. I used to sit in the sort of the group dealing with this stuff. I've always been in favor of looking into what can we do even better. It's not all that bad as it is, perhaps. But anyway, perhaps it will be. Should we continue to support the development assistance project by 1% of gross national income? Well, that's up to Parliament to decide. Up until now, yes. Should we rearrange our resources to singularly deal with NATO issues or join the European Union? I'm in favor of joining the European Union. I think Johan and I, we have shared this vision for about 150 years or so. Yeah. So will it happen? I don't know. And if we should join the European Union, I'm not quite sure if it happens soon, then by the very nature of the European Union, we will have to rearrange our resources somehow.
At least the MFA is modernizing by moving all its staff into landscape offices.
Yeah.
Fit for the new era.
We know what science says about that. It's an enormously bad idea.
I'm going to open for questions very soon, so raise your hand and I'll take note of you. Simone, I just want to dig into something you talked about, the repertoire, of what repertoires the states have. Can you just expand on that? What repertoires do they actually have?
Well, there are some, wonderful people on this panel who can talk to that. No, but it is a good question, and I think it's also the rethink has a little bit to do with what can one actually achieve, and therefore what is needed to achieve that. And as I am mainly working on security cooperation and particular security assistance, which is in and of itself a term that is set in different historical time period and is framed differently. It was framed differently during the Cold War. Then we had the liberal intervention, liberal internationalism, which had a certain different language. And now we are, let's say, in a much more cruder way. The repertoires mean that one can indeed create connections, okay? And those are indeed obviously formal diplomatic, they are economic, they are through shared understanding of partnership, which are long-term and enduring. Yet, the important thing is that the repertoires, in my personal view, do not target building patronage, okay? Because I don't think this is a model that we necessarily want to move into. So yeah, maybe just that.
Maybe Jon, on the topic of security, I'm sure in terms of repertoire and Europe, you would think about defense industry and competitiveness in the defense industry. What is how's Europe's repertoire in defense industry doing?
That's a kind of a difficult question, but I guess history has shown us that every time Europe spends more money on defense, the result is usually fragmentation, not integration. So why should it be different this time? It's still, you know, it's kind of remains to be seen that we are able to do better on that question at the moment. Just think of capabilities like tanks. US has one, and Europe has lots of different, same on other types of equipment. So, yeah.
One more question, maybe for Christian and/or Johan. We're talking about diplomacy, and we've been sort of touching upon it, but the increasing importance of networks and economic power in international diplomacy, and this is very much on the agenda in Norway these days. It's taken a global hit in terms of our credibility and our ways of working to gain influence and pursue Norwegian interests abroad. How much is that proliferation of actors in and around these needs for networks and economic power a challenge?
Okay, no, it's a challenge, but I think it's absolutely necessary to have these connections with networks. And I must say, part of the foreign policy, or the debate about foreign policy in Norway now worries me quite a lot, because in many ways it's pointing towards a less active foreign policy with less involvement, that things should be reined in, that it's suspicious to have international networks, and I believe this is a grave mistake, because there is a risk that we fall back into a foreign policy which will be more observing, passive. And I mean, if you want to understand today's world, you need to be out there. Sometimes I look for the term from social anthropology about participant observation. You need to be out there. And you need to interact not only with conflict parties, but you also need to interact with knowledge environments, think tanks. Obviously, I think it's a good thing that you are going through the financing of these things and the money that has been contributed to the results. That is a very good thing that we are doing. But we really need to stand up, not for the foreign ministry as a system, but for diplomacy as a method. Because today there are so many people attacking diplomacy as a method, and we see that there is an expansion of the use of military force to with the argument that this will solve problems. Having worked with the peace process in Colombia, they tried to solve the problem for 50 years with military means. Didn't work. And I think when we look at Iran today, we also see that the chances for a military solution are rather bleak. Something needs to be done through diplomacy.
I agree with everything Johan said. Excellent. Networks is nothing new. Hasn't been since Adam met Eve, basically. Enormously important. And in Norway we have a fairly well-functioning system. Perhaps it should work even better. The fact that the foreign minister and other ministers as well come to parliament on regular occasions for secret deliberations, where they can talk about these stuff. Don't forget that. This is we're an open democracy, but some things will have to be kept secret, not to everyone at all times. But we have channels to inform Parliament as well as the other members of the cabinet, for that matter. Economic prowess. Remember that the main reason why Napoleon in the final analysis was beaten, they were economic. France was basically bankrupt, whereas the British and the Germans, they had negotiated with the Rothschild family, networking, and they basically had limitless resources. You can follow the same kind of argument when it comes to the United States Civil War between the North and the South. It was the economic aspect that changed the course of events. And there are many other, well, look at World War II, etc., etc., etc. So the fact that economics plays a vital role, that is nothing new in world history. Has it changed that now they would have individuals, Peter Thiel and others? Well, I've already referred to the Rothschild family, so this is nothing new either. Has it changed over the past couple of decades? Probably. At the turn of the previous century, the Rockefeller family controlled 2% of US gross domestic product. Enormously influential also in international affairs. So I'm not saying that everything remains the same. The world changes all the time. But we will have to put economic prowess too into perspective.
Jon, you had a two-finger.
I think it's a paradox that when there is more and more demanded of the diplomatic service that is now being put basically under scrutiny. That's very good that we have. We should know a little bit of how money is spent and so forth.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't stop the activity. It needs to be accelerated, I think, and it broadened to more themes. So it's not only the foreign service. I mean, across all the ministries, there is a need for competence because they all engage. So.
I will take a couple questions. Please introduce yourselves and ask a question. Don't provide a lecture. It happens from time to time. We have Steinar first, then Olga and Pernille, and then we'll collect once more.
Steinar Bryn from the Nansen Academy in Lillehammer. I have two questions. The first, talking about diplomacy. I've been spending a lot of time in the Western Balkan. And we closed the embassy in Macedonia the same week as Macedonia opened the embassy in Oslo. We have closed the embassy in Kosovo. And with all that interaction between Norwegian citizens that travel to Kosovo back and forth, and the role Norway's had, diplomatically speaking, it is strange that we closed this embassy. I had a group of politicians from Sarajevo with me to the parliament, and they were nervous. Are we now going to close the embassy in Sarajevo? And they asked the members of parliament, and they were not even informed that the embassy in Kosovo had been closed. So who are deciding this policy around embassies, and is this a sign that diplomacy is a little bit moving away from embassies? My second question is simply, I'm working with the Budapest Center for Dialogue and Prevention of Mass Atrocities. We are looking at why didn't diplomacy prevent the war in Ukraine, and why hasn't diplomacy done a better job in somehow stopping the war after it started? And it looks as if there is a difference between the diplomacy on level 1 and level 2. So on level 1, it's more principled and less pragmatic. On level 2, where they negotiate prisoner exchange and these kind of things, it's more pragmatic and less principled. And there is, without doubt, more communication between Ukrainians and Russians on level 2 than on level 1. The question is, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to move the culture from level 2 up to level 1?
My name is Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an independent analyst, and my two excellent ex-colleagues, Johan and Christian, both emphasize the usefulness of networking, and maybe especially the element of secrecy in networking. Now, Johan also described a phenomenon which is well known in Norway, a process or phenomenon starting with informal diplomacy in certain networks, evolving into formal diplomacy. Now, the most noticeable example of this is a so-called back channel back in the early 90s, which evolved into the famous, or perhaps we should say now infamous, Oslo Agreement. My question to you, Johan, is what are the lessons learned from the experience of this way of working? Thank you.
Pernille?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I was glad to hear, Christian, that you kind of refer to multilateralism. It's still functioning, so it's not multilateralism, it's not dead. And you also refer to European Union as a key example of how this is functioning. And then I would like to, I mean, now the EU is progressing towards strategic autonomy out of necessity. This was a very controversial concept for many years. Now it has been kind of mainstream. But it is understood in partly a different way. And Jon, you mentioned fragmentation in the defense area, and that has been kind of the rule of the game. But I would say that it's not really fragmentation because it's moving in the right direction. It's more differentiation. And it's possible to achieve, it seems like the EU now seems like it's possible to achieve strategic autonomy through differentiated integration, both vertically and horizontally. So that means that you try to find a way to integrate the UK in some form, not as a member, but cooperate more closely, also with Norway. And I wonder how, especially for the representatives, Christian and Jon from the ministry, you're not from the ministry now, but
No.
but how?
I'm on leave.
yeah, that's true. But for Christian, then, how can Norway participate in this kind of move towards strategic autonomy? And maybe for you, it's a different question, because you're now with NOREF. And peace and reconciliation is something that the EU is also very concerned about, and often want to cooperate more closely with Norway. But then Norway kind of wants to have, no, this is kind of, have a feeling that this is a different, this is our field, this is kind of Norwegian speciality. And when I have interviewed people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the peace and reconciliation, they're not very interested in what's going on in this domain in the EU. So I would like to hear your reflection, and Simone, you've been outside in Norway for some. How do you see this from the outside? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll collect more questions, but I think there's ample material here to respond to. There's the closing of embassies in the Western Balkans. I think Christian might want to reply to that, and why diplomacy didn't work, and how to make diplomacy effective from track 1 to track 2 in Ukraine. It's the usefulness of networking, the lessons learned, and then Pernille Rike, by the way, didn't introduce herself, Director of Arena Center for European Studies and a research professor at NUPI. On differentiated integration to, I think, all the panelists, if they want to reply, but also on the question of peace and why don't we cooperate more with the EU on peace. So, Christian, you want to start?
Okay, very good indeed. Those are great questions. I was the Director General for European Affairs and Trade Policy when we closed down embassies in the Western Balkans. I was in favor of all of them. And the reason for that was quite simply imperial overstretch. We were overstretched. We had to concentrate our resources. Kosovo, Macedonia, adding to that Slovenia and Bulgaria in the same region. We always have people who have particular interests, say, when we closed our embassy in Sri Lanka, when we closed down our embassy in country X. But it's the government's responsibility to make sure that our resources are being spent where it can, basically profit. I'm not saying it was unprofitable to be in the Western Balkans. Perhaps we should have done otherwise. However, I was in no doubt when the Foreign Minister decided on this back in the days that this was a proper and correct decision. We are still probably, relative to Norway's interests, overrepresented in the Balkans. Well, by the way, it's the government's responsibility and prerogative to decide on where we should be. By the way, at that time we had more than 100 missions abroad. 100 missions abroad. Yes. It is fine that we reduced that slightly, and that has been done. Why didn't diplomacy stop the Russia's war against Ukraine? Quite simply, as everyone here will know, President Putin was hell-bent on that war. Nothing could stop him. Well, apart from perhaps attacking Moscow, or something dramatic like that. Pernille, excellent. Olga, wonderful as usual, but I'll go straight to Pernille. Strategic autonomy. I was very skeptical when when the French floated that original. Many were skeptical. Why? Was it just a byword for protectionism? Partly it is. Partly it is. One should help French industry. Much of French industry is awful, old-fashioned. Well, I'm making a caricature of it. And now suddenly that has been the renaissance, and I can understand why, of course. So now it's all the flavor of the month. How could Norway participate? As you know more about than almost anyone in Norway, Pernille, but we have been pretty adept in closing in on the European Union. Say the EEA agreement, of course, sort of the bulwark, but the Schengen Agreement, the Dublin Convention, and about 100 different agreements. So we are very close, as a matter of fact, you pointed it out there. We are very close to the European Union, and we probably continue to be. That might be one of the reasons why we will remain outside the European Union. So I'm not worried that we will come on the outside of any strategic autonomy, as it also will be in the European Union interest. And the final word is the ferro industry that was hit by particular arrangements by the European Union, which left our industry on the outside and not on the inside. Well, I don't know how you look at it, Pernille, but that was a breach of the EEA agreement. And it was basically, it was a sort of an assessment made by the government that we shouldn't make a war on that one. We should accept it and then rather seek assurances from the European Commission President that it will not happen again. Well, it might. But anyway, we do as well as we can.
Thank you. Wonderful questions. I think I want to just perhaps pick up a little bit on Pernille's point about strategic autonomy and, where is sort of Europe traveling, because in the end of the day, there is, I think, an expressed interest in forging a stronger European level, let's say, entity, right? I mean, and what we have, which has been, Europe or the EU's modus operandi for a very long time, is a sort of, let's say we got this variegated political geography, right? We got the Schengen Agreement that covers, a set of countries. We got the Eurozone, others. We got, the borders of Europe are not well defined, right? We are now reminded again that Cyprus is not a NATO member. We are constantly reminded, however, about this variegated geography, which creates a lot of, it attracts a lot of political energy, and perhaps to some extent too much, right? There's to holding and forging all of this together. It's a sort of a full-time job. I will, however, indeed refer to Counselor and colleagues who have been, done wonderful work on what sort of ad hocism, in a sense, may be doing to international institutions. So from where I'm sitting, I think that Norway is playing this in the way it has to play, right? It is operating alongside the United Kingdom now, and it's kind of comfortable in that position. Do I see that this is necessarily a sustainable long-term strategy? Not quite, I think. And of course, we are watching France taking this to a new level with nuclear deterrence. And I think this is certainly going to, in part, I think, drive. I would agree here that somehow defense is going to be driving the political and also the economic, institutional level, manifestations or sort of a deepening grounding here. May I say one more thing which has to do with back-channel diplomacy, and I will certainly leave it to the experts. But I want to say that I think that the original theory, and thank you for the question, the original theory on back-channel diplomacy was written in a certain time. And this was, the mid-1990s. There's a certain optimism in what can be achieved, also in terms of building sort of positive peace, right? Liberal of a kind, or a certain, inclusive forms of peace building. And back channels, the theory of it was written then. I think what has, come after is a field of institutions and practices that is quite committed to this, let's say, silent diplomacy. And that field is in a certain level, it was it was born in with a certain mindset, okay, with a certain outlook on the world, where, let's call it, liberalism was possible, in all its normative shapes and forms. And if we're looking to those actors who populate this field, of course you got certain states that are big donors, let's say, or providers of this field, but we got a variety of organizations that in the Norwegian space we have now become more familiar with. The Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, it's not staple knowledge, but they are quite big in this field. We got the CMI in Finland, we got Conciliation Resources in the UK, etc., etc. That field is in a crisis because of its origins, because it is trying to catch up with the Qataris, the Chinese and others who are populating this field. So I'm concerned with the theory of back-channel diplomacy, having created a field which is not quite able, let's say, to adapt to the current circumstances. Thank you.
Okay, yes, I'll start with a question from Gunnar. Thank you. I think it's interesting in the debate we have now about this policy here in Norway. In many ways, the peace process in the Middle East and back channel, etc., moved in a way from the start of a heroic tradition into the original sin. Actually, I think one important lesson is actually that peace processes and back channels I'll dive more into the back channels later, but are not usually the model we are working with any longer. And first of all, I think it's very important to stress that this is, I would say, a normal part of conflict diplomacy is a normal part of diplomacy. It's not an heroic exercise where you come out of the jungle with a beautiful agreement and everything is fixed. So we are trying to move away from it, and I must say people who have been working with this have nourished this myth, and probably also because they needed it to promote a new field of activity. But I think it's time to sort of understand that this is part of the, I would say, I hope, mainstay of diplomacy. And as I said, part of this toolbox we need to go down into even more together with our European partners if we want to be artisans in this system or this lack of system that we are now seeing, at least in the field of conflict diplomacy. I agree with Christian on the multilateral, that there is still a strong element there. And this is actually something, and this can bring me, well, there are a lot of other lessons, Gunnar, from this process as well. And I must say it's been interesting also to take in the science.
You mentioned Colombia, didn't you?
I did Colombia.
Yes.
And Colombia is interesting because Colombia, I would say, is maybe the last, what they call a comprehensive peace agreement. I didn't participate in the negotiations that took place in Havana. But there too, an interesting track. It started as an informal discussion internally in Colombia, where Norway got involved. It then moved into, and it was prepared for a long, long time. Then they had a secret phase, 2 years, and then more public negotiations for 3 years. And you have a comprehensive peace agreement, which is very broad. All the fields are covered. And I participated in the implementation of it. And you saw then all the tricky issues that emerge when you try to implement such an accord. But anyway, I think it made a big change. But in today's world, it's difficult to make such an agreement. Why? There's one chapter on inclusivity, gender. There's one chapter on, there are chapters on human rights, on indigenous people, on accountability. All these issues are now up for discussion. And we need to push on, but it's become more difficult to make these kind of agreements in the current international setting. But I think we need to concentrate on a few fundamental elements, especially the one that people concerned by the conflict need to be consulted about. You cannot make a peace process without consulting people. And I must say that brings me back to the Middle East peace process and the Norwegian, the Oslo process. One of the criticisms that has come from the environment, the research environment, is of course that the Palestinians were not given sufficient attention. And I think that is a lesson for very many peace processes. You need to look into the asymmetric elements of it. Okay, I will stop there on that one, I think. But just on the European, yes, how do we, that we think this is our field and we don't need Europe on this. I do not agree with that. I believe we have a lot of contacts, with, especially I think with the E3 countries. Well, one is not EU, the UK, but but they are extremely important today. And I must, although I mean, I must say Europe is playing less of a role than I would like when it comes to these questions. And Norway can definitely not do this job alone, and we need to team up with other European countries. But also we need to team up with other actors. I mean, like Qatar, for instance, who is active. We need to keep an eye on what the Chinese are doing, the Turks, and that's what we try to do. And you have to be also, I think, pragmatic in your the way you build relationships. But if I may, I'm not usually criticizing the European Union, but I have one criticism. We work closely with several institutions that you mentioned here, Simone, including the European Institute for Peace, for instance, and they do a lot of interesting work. But what I hear from several of my European partner organizations, the one we work closely with, is that in Europe now, they are dependent on funding, like we are. We just depend on Norwegian funding, they depend on European funding. And the European Union is a big funder for these organizations. But what happens is that the European Union is becoming increasingly risk-averse when it comes to funding. So what they would like to fund, and I have no criticism of research, but they would maybe like to fund things that are more of theoretical aspects, developing issues around how do you solve a conflict, but in a more theoretical framework, while they shy away from more operational activities sometimes, and maybe would also favor initiatives that cannot be criticized, like getting youth together to talk about peace, or which is important because you need to sort of feed that part of the value chain as well. But they shy away, I think, from more operational and also high-level initiatives. And you see it now around several discussions in the European Union, including Iran, for instance. Should the Americans do the nuclear file alone? Europe used to be an active partner there. Of course, the United States has not been willing to include them in this phase of things. But yeah, I think it's important that the European Union also takes a stronger position on this, which is more complicated because there are many opinions inside the Union, but maybe also coalitions of the willing within the European.
Beautiful handover to me, because it was mentioned, you know, NATO and the EU has done well during this crisis since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and in many ways, yes, but also after, for example, shutting out Russia from SWIFT, but also a lot of the innovation has happened outside of these institutions because it's been, you know, Hungary has blocked or other obstacles. So you've seen innovation, obviously in the Nordics because of membership of Finland and Sweden with the NB8, which is becoming a you know, fairly active forum or arena. The Joint Expedition Force combines Norway, UK, and countries inside of the EU, and there also Ukraine has an enhanced partnership that was confirmed last spring. So this is a lot. This is the place. These kind of coalitions, and the coalition of the willing is another one, by the way, where there's a lot of effort being done. But my point, I guess, is that when the opportunity arises, if we have, cross my fingers, if there is a good election in Hungary in a month or so, and things turn around, then I think we will see some institutionalization of this. That is now happening in more kind of informal coalitions. And that poses obvious challenges to Norway. Yes, we have a very good relationship to the EU. And yes, we were very lucky during the COVID, for example, that we got the medicine through the EU, but that is not a granted. I think we will also see more pressure from the EU that this kind of absence of membership should have some cost, you know, so that when the opportunity arises, we might not, you know, draw the same benefits that we have been able to do earlier. The scales might tip in the other direction just because they want us to, you know, come closer.
Thank you. Many topics, and I just have to add all eyes on Iceland on the EU question. I think that is very, very important for Norway. What happens?
Do you really?
I think so. Depending on what happens, and the reason I do is turn the normal Norway-EU debate on its head. If I were an EU policymaker and I wanted Iceland and Norway to join, I think there should be a discussion in the EU about preferential treatment on some issues, namely fisheries and potentially the euro. And if that is possible with Iceland, I think the arguments of those in favor of not joining the EU in Norway have been swept away under their feet. So, yeah, but this, I'm just a moderator. I'm not going to say we've reached a point where that we always reach. We don't have a lot of time. But I have 3 hands, and please just question, no analysis, and then you all get a minute each to respond. We'll start at the back, all the way in the back.
Hello, thank you so much. Vegard Herfjord, International Relations Master Student from NMBU. You all talked about an increase in bilateralization and multilateralization not being dead. But do you think we see an increase in bilateralization between countries because leaders across the world has lost faith in multilateral organizations to resolve issues? Or do you think this is just a trend that will get back to normal?
Thank you. Big question here.
Yes, Arndt Schneider, Professor of Social Anthropology here at the University of Oslo. China's continued engagement with multilateralism and advocacy of it was mentioned, and that's certainly better than being just a singular imperial power player. But China is also involved, of course, in setting up what we might perceive as parallel multilateralism, namely BRICS. Also, we have experiences from the longer past, like Comic-Con and also Pact, to engage with other sort of things mirrored. So what is the role of China now and of BRICS, of multilateralism, which we might not like?
Marianne, a pointed 10-second question, please.
Well, that's going to be hard, but I'll try to be brief. I have Marianne Rydvald from Arena, Center for European Studies, and also NUPI. 2 very short comments and then a brief question. So the comments are to Christian. You said you don't really worry too much about Norway's relationship with the EU. I think that when the EU is changing very rapidly and everything becomes security, it's actually getting much more difficult for Norway to join. Also, just very briefly to John, I think that a lot of what is going on in Europe is actually either within the EU or linked to the EU. I mean, the NB6, for example, meet much more often than the NB8, which is also a bit difficult for Norway. But my question is, Johan, you mentioned a couple of times Mark Leonard's new book on order, where he distinguishes between these 2 roles that states or actors can take, being an architect developing a new system or redesigning the system, or the artisan trying to uphold the old one. So my question to the panel is then, what role do you see the EU conducting now? Is it an artisan or an architect? And what role should it take in the future?
Lovely, and I will give you all a generous 40 seconds to respond. Let's do it as an exercise. It is possible, and start at the end and work our way down here.
Thank you. I'll respond to the 2 first ones in one go, I think. Because what we see also, you know, not only in setting up alternative platforms or arenas like BRICS, but also in the UN, China is taking a bigger role, and in other inclusive multilateral organizations. Together with the Global South, I think there was very good arguments made at the beginning by Erik that for good reasons they're claiming back territory, so to speak. But what do we do when perhaps the rules-based order is not reflecting the values that we once inserted them with? Are we still then willing to support these institutions? So I'll end with a question.
Yeah, very briefly, I think the problem is the EU is divided. Some are neither architects, neither artisans. Some want to be artisans. Some want to be architects. Actually, I saw now there was criticism of von der Leyen for having gone out too close to the position of Chancellor Merz on the issue of international law, whether you should be very principled on that issues, while other was supporting that position. So that is a complication. But I also see a number of EU countries being artisans. Must say, since I've been based there, and I think Italy is actually taking on an interesting artisan role with a certain pragmatism in their near area. So I think there's a bit of both, but it would be great if they would move in the same direction. So.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, the question about if leaders have lost faith in multilateralism and things will get back to business, I think that we are fundamentally going to be in a sort of polycentric world in one way or another. I think we do see indeed new, actor states interested in the global game. But I also think that globalization, in a sense, cannot be put back in the tube, which means that we're going to see, I think, competition for the infrastructural power. And for example, referring to China, I think the development of a digital yuan, for example, is going to be tremendously important to follow. And of course also the European, and there, is Europe going to be an architect in that sense and actually go forward with the digital euro project? This is where we need to be watching. And, for many of us, maybe the technological is something we really need to just, up our ante about analyzing adequately connected to politics.
To the master student, lost faith in multilateralism. Well, I thought to make the argument that parts of multilateralism have been strengthened, not weakened. People's Republic of China, what to dislike when they seek, a more prominent role out there in multilateralism. Well, we won't hear much of human rights. That's for certain true. And remember also, in spite of talk, that China is considered by almost all its neighbors, and not only Taiwan, as a dominant, threatening power. Full stop. EU. After having dealt with this since more or less on and often since the early 1990s, I've been amazed by the flexibility and what we have achieved, Norway together, and the EFTA countries perhaps, together with the European Union. Amazing. Because it's in the European Union interest as well, to accommodate our wishes. It's in our interest, in European Union interest, and in spite of what happens in Iceland, well, remains to be seen. But I think that we can accommodate any crisis coming up as well.
What a great final sentence. I should also say, finally, on behalf of our director, Kari Osland, she sends her gratitude for this seminar and this partnership, and she apologizes for not being here. She's on a delayed flight from Dakar. And as a consequence, you've had to deal with me for an hour and 45 minutes. So she's very sorry. But luckily, we've had an amazing panel. We've had an engaged audience. So thank you so much. And please join me in thanking our participants.